And the way I remember it, last time we talked, you were doing a carnivore diet, you were big on organ meats, and you were big on eating nose to tail. And the way I understand it now, you've included honey, raw dairy, and a significant amount of fruit for carbohydrates. In each of those categories there, beyond the meat, and you're still into organs too, but in each of those categories beyond the meat, the dairy, the fruit, the honey, talk about why you've chosen to include each of those. Like, is there specific nutrients in each of those realms? Going back to your story as you shared it before, we know electrolytes was a problem you ran into as a carnivore, but why the diversity? Is it for flavor? Is it for nutrients? Why not just add, say, fruit back in and keep it more simple?
Yeah, so we can talk about all of those things individually. It's a great question. Let's talk about raw dairy. We've talked a little bit about the fruit and the honey, but I'll talk about raw dairy. So I feared dairy. I was fearful of dairy for many years because I think that pasteurized dairy was a major allergen for me growing up. I grew up in Northern Virginia. My father was a physician. My mom was a nurse. So with my asthma and eczema, I was wildly over-medicated. And I think that pasteurized dairy was a problem for me. And it wasn't until the last few years that I understood why this could potentially be. I came across a significant amount of literature. There's many, many studies showing benefits to unpasteurized dairy. There are multiple observational studies in children showing that kids who eat raw dairy, whether it's cheese, milk, butter, kefir, which is fermented milk, some people say kefir, on or off the farm have lower rates of asthma, eczema, allergies, hay fever when they're adults. That's fascinating. And it's observational, so correlation is not causation, but that's a pretty striking finding that shows up repeatedly in studies. And what we know about raw milk is that when you heat milk that comes out of a cow or a goat or a camel, whatever you want to milk, it changes the conformation of many of the proteins in that milk. And it changes the population of bacteria in the milk, many of which are commensal and probably valuable and impact the human gut in a positive way. Whey protein specifically is found to be very beneficial for humans, but especially beneficial and probably most beneficial when it's undenatured. Anything above 147 degrees or 150 degrees Fahrenheit seems to change the conformation of the whey protein, and it looks like many of these immunologic benefits are lost. So that's a pretty big deal. So I thought, okay, if this food can affect my immune system in a positive way, potentially affect my gut in a positive way, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and it's getting me a source of bioavailable calcium and more animal-based nutrients, K2, menaquinone, choline, et cetera, it's something I want to have in my diet. And for people that drink raw milk, it's delicious. And what I found was that when I reincorporated raw dairy, first as Parmigiano Reggiano cheese and then as raw milk, I wasn't nearly as lactose intolerant as I expected to be. And I've later learned that most of these raw milks contain bacteria that can populate the human gut and then produce this lactase enzyme, even if you've lost it. It seems that the A1 casein protein, which is another protein in milk, is only really allergenic for humans when it's pasteurized. Again, these conformational changes in the proteins of milk that happen a lot with cooking. So when I incorporated raw milk, I didn't have any recurrence of eczema. I felt better, and I was aware that I was getting like all these interesting nutrients, and I think my gut felt even better than it did before. Subjectively, and this is just my experience, I felt like when I was surfing, I could surf longer. I don't know how to describe it. It was like I had more drive to surf. I was more driven to surf for longer amounts of time. It wasn't that I was running out of gas, but I think that this is just my subjective experience, take from it what you will. I would go out in the ocean, I would surf 2.5 hours, sometimes 3 hours. Whereas before I would just kind of, after an hour and a half, I would just think, I'm done with this. I'm kind of tired. But it just changed my subjective experience, but it changed something for me. And again, my gut felt better. I think my poop got better when I started adding raw milk. The more I've learned about raw milk, the more people I've talked to. I recently went to a farm in California called Raw Farm, the biggest raw dairy in the world. And the stories I heard from them, that people have told them, what I heard in Los Angeles when I was there at Erewhon doing the smoothie launch, the first animal-based smoothie at Erewhon, so many people came up to me and talked about how raw milk had improved their gut and fixed their gut. And this is so interesting because in the space that I'm in as a physician, people who have gut issues, that's been the hardest thing to fix for them. We as humans are just bombarded our whole life with things that are bad for our gut flora. There's this trillions of bacteria in our gut, this whole another alien organism that lives between your mouth and your anus, really. Trillions of bacteria, 10 to the 16th bacteria, more cells than you have in your human body by a factor of 3 or 4, who knows? And we're just changing the composition of that collective organism with antibiotics, with pesticides, probably with lectins, defense chemicals in plants. So then this interesting question is, how the heck do you rehabilitate that? And probiotics make sense, but in my experience, they don't always work. Sometimes they make it worse. But raw milk, of all the things that I've seen clinically, raw milk is hands down the best for people's guts. And whether it's raw milk or raw kefir, fermented milk, those two things are incredibly valuable for human guts in terms of reestablishing healthy populations in the gut. And that just makes so much sense to me intuitively. And I don't know if there's any published literature. We need to do some, but there are studies on raw milk and kids with respiratory tract infections. There's studies on the immunologic differences between raw and pasteurized milk for mothers. Like I said, there's studies in kids with less allergy, asthma, and eczema. So there's a ton of literature that raw milk is beneficial for humans and affects our immune system. I've never seen anything about the gut flora, but you can imagine that raw milk is basically a probiotic food. It is the original probiotic food. And when you or I were hopefully breastfeeding as children, the first thing that we had was this milk from our mothers with thousands of different types of organisms. Breast milk is not sterile. Just like raw cow's milk, it's not sterile. It's just that those skin flora are what our bodies expect. Even if it's from a mammal other than your mom, it seems to be very beneficial for the human gut in a lot of different ways. So that's really interesting that you can, in some ways, for people that have, and this may sound a little controversial, but I think it makes the point, for people that have issues with their gut, that have potentially negatively changed the populations in their gut, in some ways you can return to breastfeeding by getting raw, good quality mammalian milk into your diet. And that's really cool.
All right, there's a few nuances I want to get into within the milk realm here. You've stated your obvious preference for raw versus pasteurized. Do you ever have pasteurized milk, though, just more as a calorie source, as something more as a neutral food? And say like you're out to eat and there's less choices, will you have it then, or would you ever bring it in the house? I'm just curious how stern you are on only having raw.
I'm intense about it. I don't do anything that's pasteurized. In fact, I was recently in Greece with a friend and we were on his boat, and they said that we were drinking raw milk, but we weren't drinking raw milk. And that was really the main change. Now, again, I'm in Greece, so I'm eating different foods, but I'm basically eating meat and fruit and honey. And I could tell that my body was reacting differently to that pasteurized milk. And again, it's just my anecdote, but I was getting like little acne. And it's funny, I would get acne like on my collarbone. I would get acne like here on my shoulder. I never get this, right? A little bit on my neck. Like it seems to be like an autoimmune type of reaction. I got these multiple sort of like pimples on my collarbone, along my collarbone. And I think that was related just observationally to this pasteurized milk. So I've just learned that my immune system doesn't like pasteurized milk, and I would rather not drink milk than have something that's pasteurized. I don't think it works for me.
Got it. So it has to be raw. And through you sharing your dairy story there, we know you're into cow milk. What about other animals such as sheep and goat? Oftentimes in the health and wellness space, people that don't do cow for whatever reason will include these other animal milks. And there's been talk that they're, easier on the body for people that have trouble with cow milk. So how do you feel? Say you're at Whole Foods and you're picking up some raw cheese and you have an option of sheep, goat, or cow. Will you grab all three to have diversity, or do you gravitate more to one?
I like them all, but I really like goat milk. I drink a lot of goat milk here in Costa Rica. I would definitely drink sheep's milk. I don't have any problem with other species' milks if they're mammals. I've had camel milk before. I've heard there's horse milk. I would like to try horse milk. I think I would try any mammal's milk if it's raw. I think it's fine. And when I'm at Whole Foods, usually if I can find a raw sheep's milk cheese, I like that. Or a raw goat cheese. I tend to prefer those, but I don't think there's anything really different. People get kind of hung up on the A1 versus A2, and I think that's not as much of an issue if it's unpasteurized. The tricky part about Whole Foods is that Whole Foods doesn't do raw milk because they did have an experience where one of their customers got sick from a poorly produced raw milk farm many years ago. Thankfully, Sprouts does raw milk, especially in California, other stores. And Sprouts actually has some raw kefir from this raw farm throughout the country, if you can find that as well.
How do you feel about colostrum from a cow? This is a popular supplement that can be found. I believe Heart and Soil even has colostrum in one of the products at least.
Yeah.
Is this something you include in your diet on a regular basis?
When I can get it, yeah. I think that the colostrum, so the grass-fed colostrum from Heart and Soil, is one of the most common supplements that I take because it's hard to get fresh colostrum. I can often get fresh liver or fresh heart. In Costa Rica, it's not too hard to find fresh testicles. Heart and Soil makes desiccated organs, so if I can't find those or someone can't find those organs, you can get the capsules, which are freeze-dried. But even here in Costa Rica, it's very hard for me to find fresh colostrum, so the freeze-dried colostrum is pretty good. And I think that colostrum is incredibly valuable for humans. I mean, there's probably 250 studies on colostrum in the medical literature. There's a peptide in colostrum called colostrin, studied again for childhood respiratory tract infections. Colostrum's been studied in Alzheimer's disease models. It's been studied in humans for cognitive decline. I mean, it's a pretty powerful food. Colostrum is the first milk from mammals, and it's, quote, milk. It's mostly immunoglobulins. So it's a very highly immunologically, I would say, active substance, and it's valuable. It's really cool. I'm glad that people are beginning to use it and appreciate it, because I think that just like raw milk, it's kind of like a concentrated form of raw milk.
All right, so we have the colostrum. I know you're big on to, obviously, your company, Heart and Soil, again. You're big into organs in supplement form or having them as whole foods. Any other supplements that you've included since we last talked?
None. Salt. And I'm intentional about the salt. And I try to find salt that's low in microplastics. There's a couple of different salts. There's a Kalima salt. There's a couple of other different salts that can say they're low in microplastics. So microplastics are just getting into all of our food supplies, and I'm just intentional about that. But I haven't really felt the need, and it's been a very interesting, I think, endeavor to think about what supplements I would possibly include. A lot of people include magnesium, and so I did chronometer for my diet on my podcast, which is now called the Saladino MD Podcast. And I'm getting like 125% of the RDA for magnesium in my diet from milk, from orange juice, from coconut water, and meat is actually a really good source of magnesium. In terms of minerals, if you're eating liver and you're eating red meat, I can't think of a mineral that you're going to be deficient in. I mean, you're going to get manganese. I think people sometimes get wrapped around the axle with thiamine, but there's plenty of thiamine in different fruits. There's plenty of thiamine in organs and animal foods. So in terms of B vitamins, if you're including liver, you've got riboflavin, you've got choline, you've got biotin, things that are not as rich in muscle meat. In fact, riboflavin and biotin are particularly poor in muscle meat, so adding organs helps with that. You're getting plenty of B6, B5, B12. Folate is also in liver and egg yolks. So in terms of the B vitamins, you're pretty well covered. In terms of the minerals, you're pretty well covered. In terms of the other vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin E is really prevalent in animal fat, butter. Vitamin C is in fruit, orange juice. I'll have some fresh squeezed orange juice every day. And then the carbohydrates help with the other mineral retention so that I don't have to do a whole lot of these electrolytes anymore. I don't supplement potassium. It actually can be dangerous to supplement potassium depending on your kidney status. So I think that a salt, basically a sodium, allows your body to hold on to all of the other minerals. And you look at this animal-based diet, which is basically what I've called this meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy. There's really nothing missing, and I'm just not saying that. That's what I see on chronometer. So I don't feel the need to supplement with anything else. But I'm interested in what kind of things people feel like they need or benefit from. But I think as long as I can get the organs and I'm getting the fresh organs or the desiccated organs, like hardened soil, I don't see a need to do much of anything here.
Well, one of the things I think is really unique about your diet versus, say, some of the carnivores or other people eating an animal-based diet is the amount of organs that you consume, or at least presumably from following your work online. A lot of people these days, whether they're, variety of different diets, people are including them for the different health benefits and the amount of nutrients they contain. But it seems like for you, you're consuming them in whole food form and in supplement form. You're the founder of a company that, does organ supplements, so that makes sense. You're going to be having a lot of them compared to the average Joe. But what I'm getting at is, how many organs do we need? And the reason I ask that is I'm picturing somebody back in the day, ancestral times, killing an animal, harvesting the organs. They're going to have a lot of muscle meat. They're going to have a relatively small amount of organs. So again, in your diet, it seems like you're having quite a few of these. Do you feel like you're doing more than our ancestors would do? Do you feel that's just an advantage of the 21st century and having access to them and you're better off because of it? I'm just curious on how you think of that from an ancestral perspective.
Yeah. So I think that when I was doing a strict carnivore diet, perhaps because I was only eating meat and organs, I was eating more organs than I am now and a different variety. But right now on a daily basis, I have about half an ounce of liver, maybe an ounce of liver per day. So not a huge amount, maybe the size of a quarter per liver. And I'll do like frozen raw usually, or desiccated like hardened soil. I'll do a few ounces of heart every day because I can just throw it on the grill with my meat. Heart is interesting. It's a muscle, but it is uniquely high in things like anserine, taurine, coenzyme Q10, some other peptides that are found in heart. So my go-tos on a daily basis are liver and heart. And I think if people are getting liver especially, that's a huge upgrade. If you add a little bit of heart every once in a while or a couple times a week, you're doing great. I might add in some testicle a few times a month just because we know the testicle contains bioactive androgens. I mean, I don't know if you've heard this story, but all of our supplements at Hardened Soil now are Informed Sports approved, which is like the NSF. It's actually more rigorous than NSF. So they have no contaminants, quote unquote, so that professional athletes can take them. So all the supplements are Informed Sports except one. Only one of them failed, and that was our whole package supplement, which is the one with testicle. And it didn't fail because we add anything to it. It failed because testicle in the supplement naturally contains bioactive androgens, androstenedione, testosterone. So Informed Sports won't certify that one because it contains androgens. So we know the testicle contains androgens. And so, I'm a man. My testosterone is great. My libido is good, especially when I sleep well. I've shown this in my blood work all the time. But I think testicle is valuable for men to eat, maybe even women sometimes too. But definitely as a man, I like to eat testicle every once in a while. And that's about the extent of my organs these days. If I come across, sometimes I get some tripe or some intestines. I'll cook some like intestines on the grill, and those can be really good. But I don't do a lot of different things anymore. I think that the desiccated organs help with that. Beef organs is heart, liver, kidney, spleen, and pancreas. That's easier for me than cooking kidney and pancreas and spleen, which are not super great. I haven't figured out a way to make those easily. So I don't eat a ton of organs anymore, but I think that the organs that I eat are like the most impactful ones that I can get easily. And that's what I want people to know, that even if you just include liver, it's going to be a big deal. And people, it's incredible what you hear from people who include things like testicle or other organs in their life too.
All right, let's talk about processing when it comes to organ meat. So you mentioned a few different things there. Frozen liver, you mentioned cooking some organs. We know the supplements are desiccated, which is freeze-dried, right? Is that synonymous?
I think it's a little different, but yeah.
Okay, well, talk about supplements then and the different ways of processing, and then talk about why someone would want to have certain organs prepared in certain ways and what we lose when they're cooked or freeze-dried.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this conversation is that when I was with the Hadza, they didn't eat anything raw. They cooked it all. So we were eating cooked liver. They were not eating raw liver. But some African tribes will eat raw liver. And I'll tell you that when we hunted and killed animals with the Hadza, and they took the liver out of the animal, they treated that thing like gold. It was like placed on a rock, very carefully cooked, and then divided with the tribe. This probably makes sense being in the bush. Parasites are a thing. So I think there's value to cooked liver. I have found that raw liver is easier for me to eat. I can either chew it, and I think it's fairly safe because I believe that I'm getting it from a good source. I've never gotten sick from raw liver, but people should know that raw meat, raw organs, raw vegetables, all of these have risks. Raw milk, very safe, but I think that the most number of food poisoning cases actually come from raw vegetables now, and that pasteurized milk has just as many problems with contamination as raw milk does today. And if you get raw milk from a place like Raw Farm, they tested a whole bunch. That stuff is super, super safe. But if you want to eat organs raw, that's great. I've eaten a lot of raw organs in my day. Raw heart, pretty freaking safe. If you've ever eaten a rare steak or a blue rare steak, you know that you can eat muscle meat pretty darn rare and raw and be just fine the vast majority of the time. But I do think that if you eat a whole bunch of ground beef raw, you're probably going to run into problems just because the meat is all ground together. So there are values to cooked organs. What's interesting for me about freeze drying organs is that you can basically take the water out of an organ at a temperature below what you find in the freezer at your house. That's what freeze drying is. There's something called the triple point where you can sublimate water. You can just take it directly from a solid to a gas if you make the pressure low enough. So that's what a freeze dryer does. It lowers the pressure and you can just take the water out of something at a very, very low temperature. So what's interesting about that is that you can make these desiccated organs, well, let's say freeze dried is probably the correct term, and it preserves as many of the nutrients as possible. There were studies done on raw organs and freeze-dried organs in the 1950s on animals, and they found that there were these bioactive factors, probably peptides, that were present in raw and present in freeze-dried organs that were not present in cooked organs. So that kind of stuff makes me think, oh, it's probably good to get some cooked organs, probably good to get some freeze-dried organs, maybe good to get some raw organs too. But I think that there is something to this like idea that if you cook your organs and you cook all of your food all the way through, you may be missing some benefits. I came across a nutrient recently that I was reminded of named taurine. And there's a lot of longevity arguments out there now against meat. People in the longevity space don't eat meat. Ironically, they also take about 100 supplements, many of which are nutrients found exclusively in meat. Things like carnosine or taurine. And the data on taurine is very compelling. There was actually an article published in June or July of 2023 in Science talking about how across worms, across mice, and across primates, taurine supplementation extends lifespan. Well, taurine is only found in meat. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense that something found exclusively in meat would extend lifespan, but that meat would be bad for your lifespan. And I did a podcast recently about that. There's a number of nutrients like that: anserine, creatine, carnosine, B12, 4-hydroxyproline, which is a component of collagen. All of these are found exclusively or vastly predominantly in meat and connective tissue, and they're very good for humans. So it just kind of flies in the face of these anti-longevity meat arguments. But the point of this discussion here was that taurine is actually denatured 40 to 50% when you cook meat. So there's probably benefit to eating a medium rare or a rare steak. You can sear the outside, get rid of anything problematic on the outside of the steak, but then you're getting some rare-ish meat in the middle. And even though I talked about the dangers of ground beef, I eat most of my hamburgers medium rare. And I think that the same goes with liver. You know, when you're eating raw liver, you're getting more taurine, you're getting all of the bioactive factors. So that's kind of the spectrum and why you'd want to do one thing or another. The safest thing is a freeze-dried organ or a cooked organ. And I think that the most risky thing is a raw organ. In the middle is probably liver that's cooked on the outside and pink in the middle, just like a steak. But again, I definitely roll the dice and haven't had any issues with fully raw liver. I think freezing it probably helps somewhat. But people don't have to feel like that's something they have to do if that's not doable for them.
Got it. Let's come back to the honey piece of the diet. I'm curious, because you've added in fruit and honey, is there anything specific in the honey that you're getting nutrient-wise that you wouldn't get from the fruit? Or is that just to add more diversity?
It's more diversity. I like the way honey tastes in raw milk. And I'm pretty active. So this morning I surfed for 2 hours. in the ocean, and then I'll get a workout, maybe skate this afternoon. And in interesting, humbling fashion, I've found that basically the more carbohydrates I eat, the better I feel now. The more carbohydrates I eat, the better I recover, the stronger I am, the better my libido is, the better I sleep. So I don't fear carbohydrates at all. And oftentimes I'll eat 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. And I'm 5'9.5", 170 pounds. So I'm not a huge human, but I am quite active, and I'll get 300 plus grams. And the easiest way for me to do that is with honey in addition to fruit. I mean, I can get orange juice in the morning. I can squeeze some orange juice. I can have local tropical fruit. Right now we've got rambutan in season and some mangosteen, which people may or not be familiar with. There's some mangoes, there's pineapple. But getting 300 grams of carbohydrates from fruit would take a lot of work. And fruit juice makes it easier. Sometimes when I talk about fruit juice, people say that's not evolutionarily appropriate. And I think, well, I'm pretty sure our ancestors would juice fruit. They don't like fiber that much. When I was with the Hadza, they would often chew roots and spit out all the fiber. So I think it's common for humans to sort of make juice in their mouth by spitting out extra fiber in fibrous fruits. And if they had the ability, I think that it's common to see them make juice. I mean, many indigenous cultures make sugarcane juice, which is quite delicious and probably very healthy for humans without being processed. Juicing is very common, more common than people think. So I could make a lot of juice out of the fruit, but the honey is another thing that's beneficial, I think, in terms of the carbohydrates. There's actually also studies in diabetics showing that honey improves insulin sensitivity. So I think that coming back to this idea that, and this may sound ironic to people, I hope to share ideas that are valuable for people. And the intention has always been to suggest the highest degree of variety with the least amount of toxins. And that's expanding over time, right? In the carnivore diet, there's not a lot of variety, but I think that I was thinking incorrectly about the toxins that could be in fruit. I was worried about the sugars there. So now I think, why not have honey in your diet? It actually has a lot of good data in diabetics, cardiovascular disease, in addition to fruit and fruit juice, which have similar data. There's data with blood red orange juice, regular orange juice, and a few other fruit juices, I think grape juice, showing improvements in endothelial function, sort of post-contraction dilatation in the endothelium, which is the blood vessel lining on the inside of both the veins and the arteries. So when people say that fruit is bad for humans or it causes insulin resistance, I sort of shake my head and wait for them to show me any sort of data that really corroborates that and doesn't really work that way. There's data showing that fructose is harmful in animal models, but fructose is not the same as fruit in a whole food form. And animal models are uniquely bad at predicting fructose in humans because mice and rats metabolize fructose very differently than humans. People also conflate studies with high fructose corn syrup and things with honey and fruit. So those don't look the same in human data either. There's actually data in mice, interestingly, showing that when mice are fed sucrose, so table sugar, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, versus high fructose corn syrup, which is theoretically also glucose and fructose, at pretty similar ratios, the mice gain much more weight on the high fructose corn syrup. So you have one, component which is probably moderately processed in sucrose, and one component which is highly processed in high fructose corn syrup, and you're not looking at really the same thing. So that's a bit of a digression about fruit and sugar fear, but hopefully I answered your question there.
You talked about something there I want to highlight. I think it's really important. The fact that as we're hearing about your diet and how it's evolved and how you have quite a few carbohydrates now, it's important to note the fact that you are highly active. And you did touch on this, but you are somebody who is out surfing, and you talked about skateboarding. Like, I'm only judging this from what I see online, but you're moving your body, throughout the whole day, more than the average person by far. So for somebody who's taking this in right now, and maybe they're working an office job and they're like, oh, I can have carbs again and honey. And it's like, you need to really take that in context of the lifestyle you're living, which is very unique.
And at the website, which is Salidino MD.co, there's a free animal-based calculator. And we kind of put a metric in there for how active are you. And you can go and say, oh, I'm very active or moderately active or just minimally active. And the calculator will scale the carbohydrates for you. So I think that definitely not everyone needs 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. Most people probably don't need 200 grams of carbohydrates a day. But for some people who are elite athletes or who are active, getting more carbohydrates clearly has profound benefits. And oftentimes when people go from carnivore to animal-based, they won't eat enough carbohydrates and that causes problems. So if anything, people tend to err on the side of too few carbohydrates, actually. And that causes issues. I hear people all the time. I mean, we're doing this month at Heart and Soil, we're doing the Animal-Based 30, which is a free 30-day animal-based eating challenge. And people will often say, I do jujitsu and I'm getting muscle cramps. And I say, or the team will say, what are you eating? And they say, well, I'm having like 4 ounces of strawberries and a handful of blueberries a day. And we say, well, that's great. That's like 35 grams of carbohydrates. That's nothing. So getting someone at least above 100, if they're even moderately active in terms of carbohydrates, makes a massive difference. And I think some people have talked about doing an animal-based diet and they just don't. It's easier for people to get carbohydrates from oatmeal or sweet potatoes. And sweet potatoes are kind of this gray area, but oatmeal is something I'm not a huge fan of at all. It's easier for people to get carbohydrates from oatmeal than it is from fruit and honey. They just don't eat enough fruit. They don't eat enough fruit juice. We have this fear of these things. And most people tend to be too low carb and they end up just going low carb and they're keto again and they end up with all the same problems.
And another area that highlights the point I was making there of your unique lifestyle, when you talked about supplements, you didn't mention vitamin D, which is a common one for a lot of people here in North America. You're now down in Costa Rica where you're getting sun and you're out with your shirt off. And I'm here in Ontario where we have, gray skies for the majority, not the majority, maybe 2/3 of the year. So depending on your unique situation, you have to look at this with unique eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the video is showing it really well right now, but I'm pretty tan. You look good, Jesse. You look like you're tan from here. I don't know.
Well, you're catching me in that 1/3 of the year where we have sun. So I'm getting sun right now and I'm taking full advantage of that. But in the other 2/3 of the year, I'm making sure my vitamin D supplementation is in a good range. And again, it's just, you're living this really unique life. And I just want to make sure that point is highlighted.
I think vitamin D is a valuable supplement for people. And you're right. I appreciate you pointing that out. I do think that it's interesting living near the equator. So I live at a latitude of 8 north latitude. Austin, Texas, I think is 27, 28. In Ontario, you're probably 39. Who knows? Maybe 36, 34. I think Seattle was pretty far up there. And so I think that the cutoff is something like 27, 28. If you're above 27, 28 in the latitude, and you can just look this up online, there is a significant portion of the year where you have a vitamin D winter, where the sun never actually gets high enough in the sky to make any vitamin D. Even if it's a sunny day, it's valuable to be in the sun for your circadian rhythm, but you're not making any vitamin D on your skin. So you have to really do something else to get that nutrient. And for most of us, probably the ideal would be getting super tan in the summer, but even in the summer, you probably can't go out and get massively tan in Ontario because you need to do some work inside at some point. I mean, you're podcasting from indoors right now. You're losing your tan, bro. We both are.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
The carnivore community hates me. The ketogenic community hates me. The vegans don't like what I'm saying. You can give someone a diet of pure white sugar and rice, and their diabetes gets better. You get significantly less benefits from working out.